Hello and good evening, and welcome to the chat of Northern Virginia and DC chapters 2024 ADHD Resource Fair and virtual lecture series highlighting ADHD Awareness Month. I'm Pam Thomas, the coordinator for our chapter, and I'm so very glad to have you attend our first virtual lecture in the month of October, which is entitled Managing Multiple Roles as an Adult with ADHD. With our guest lecturer, Jane Singleton, career and leadership coach and founder of Launchpad for Life Coaching. Our chapter, CHAD of Northern Virginia, DC, is one of many chapters in the CHAD National Organization, and as such, aligns with the national mission of improving the lives of those affected by ADHD. We are a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offers support in a number of ways. In addition to offering this resource fair in the month of October with lectures and an in-person resource fair, we also offer a monthly lecture series on the second Tuesday evening of most months and provide support groups for parents and adults with ADHD. And while we're all volunteers here, we cover other expenses through membership dues, donations, and sponsorship. So please consider becoming a member and support our efforts. You have to excuse me, I have this really crazy allergy thing going on. So I apologize for my voice being so funny. So we're very grateful to sponsors who sponsored our resource fair, and we want to highlight them and give them a little kudos there. Our gold sponsors are McLean School and Thrive Emerge. McLean School understands students first for what they can do, not what they can't do. And you know what I'm supposed to be doing? I'm supposed to be sharing something right now. So let me just hop on here and get that going. Yes, there we go. There's a lovely logo. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, let's continue. There we go, McLean. So McLean, oh my goodness, I can't do this. So the McLean School, yeah, I forgot about this. Sorry about that. So McLean School is one of our gold sponsors. Thank you so much for being able to sponsor us for this. We've got Thrive Emerge, and they're based out of Maryland, and they have many services as far as like students, adults. They have family and parent supports. We also have our silver sponsors. College Living Experience, which is great, is an integrated experience for young adults trying to work in their college and careers that have neurodiversity. And they're really hands-on and very comprehensive. They have many locations across the United States. Wonderful, wonderful services. Aptivate has numerous educational, psychological services across the area here, from tutoring, coaching, psychological assessments, support, and advocacy. Integrated Psychology Associates offers a lot of services also in the area. Learning RX is brain training, and they do an amazing job of retraining the brain. They work with neurodiverse as well as other people that are looking to build their memory and their active learning mindfulness. Pathfinder Coaching and Tutoring, Pat Hudek, who is the founder of Pathfinder, has also been very active and continues to be active in our CHAD, is the president of the CHAD organization. She also has great coaching and tutoring services in the Northern Virginia area. Cortona Academy is a very unique educational academy right here in the Northern Virginia area as well. They have a very unique and their own personalized educational services that they give to their kids. And Commonwealth Academy, of course, I'm sure many of you know them. They also have a very unique approach to helping students learn and thrive as a neurodiverse individual. And so with that information, I would like to then turn my sights to introducing you to our speaker today. Thank you for being patient, Jane. This has been a little crazy. Okay, so let's see. Jane Singleton, who is our speaker today, specializes in career and leadership coaching for neurodiverse individuals, as well as coaches, parents, and kids through educational milestones and life transitions that help them reach their behavioral and academic goals. She has over 13 years of experience as an educational leader and specialist in understanding cognitive profiles, and is the founder of Launchpad for Life. So thank you so much, Jane, for providing this wonderful lecture today. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I will get started. So I'll just zip through this slide because essentially the title is Managing Multiple Roles as an Adult with ADHD, but I really want to set the tone for today's presentation is we're going to examine strategies for managing ADHD through an executive coach lens. I know immediately as soon as I'm presenting on ADHD, we think, oh, executive functioning coach. But executive coaching is actually for leaders. And what I did with my business is I really want us to take that framework for leaders and find the intersectionality and tailor it to people with ADHD so that they can think about strategies in a more effective way. But there's a lot of similarities to leadership coaching. So quickly about me, I'm an ICF certified executive coach. I have 13 years, as she said, working as a learning specialist and educational leader. And I started my business because I realized there's this huge gap. Like, what happens after people with ADHD leave like secondary school? The supports kind of fall away. And there's a lot that we weren't getting done in school in terms of building sense of self and future trajectory of career and all the skills you need to be successful in life. So that is why I do what I do. I like to call myself a passionate translator between neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, just because my job has required me to do that for so long. And that's why we'll spend a lot of time talking about communication. But I think what I'd love to hear a little bit is I'd love to hear, like, these are sentence starters just to kind of get to know you a little bit better. Like, what is your biggest frustration in your work and personal life as someone with ADHD? You don't have to answer all of them, but I'd love to see in the chat what are the words that kind of come up for you when I can't get my brain to turn off. I'm often thinking about, or the biggest barrier I have faced as an adult with ADHD is blank. I'm curious what you guys would fill in here. I'm going to pull. Okay. Task initiation. And just so you know, anything I say is going to be anonymous. I'm not calling anybody out. Okay. How to prioritize work. That comes up with my clients all the time. Consistency. All right, that's great. Too many tasks, right? And that's overwhelmness. We're going to talk about that a lot because I think that too many tasks and the prioritization of things are so intertwined, especially as an adult, when you have so many demands and you're pulled in so many different directions. Oh, phone technology. Letting others down on myself. Letting others down on myself when I don't get things done that I want. Right. And I'm curious. I'd love to see like a thumbs up or something. How many of you actually struggle with like the perfectionistic side along with the ADHD? I'd be curious because I think that piece of like sometimes not following through has a lot to like holding ourselves to such a high standard that we'd almost rather not share it or move forward with it because we have that high standard. Thank you. Yes, I see that all the time. And I've worked with a lot of twice exceptional people, and I just don't think we talk about it enough. Yeah, that's so well said. Perfectionism about being efficient, which makes me inefficient. Great. Well, I always say if you can name it, you can tame it. All right. So this is our agenda today. we're going to understanding themes of how ADHD characteristics impact multiple roles, which you guys will be familiar with. But we're also going to talk about a coaching framework and process and how it's a little bit different. We're actually going to try to do a little practice with what I call a values framework, which is part of my identity dashboard resource. And then I really want to talk about how do we really create sustainable strategies? Because I think that's the biggest problem I see is like in school, even we see a lot of band-aids. And I think as we're constantly in survival mode. It feels like just band-aid after band-aid and we're constantly exhausted. So the idea is like, how can we actually create sustainable habit change? And then the biggest one for me that I see with every client is really there's always a missing communication piece. I put up here this QR code in case you have to leave early. There's a survey and I'm going to send some free resources related to my identity dashboard afterwards. So if you're somebody who needs it twice, I have it at the beginning and the end. You can go ahead and capture that QR code on your phone. And if you fill it out, I'll send you some free resources. Okay, I think I put ADHD characteristics into themes because I think categorizing them is really helpful to managing them. So I put those into the buckets of self-awareness. And I think a big one right there is capacity. And that's where kind of perfectionism might be in conflict with how much we can do at once. Level of control. A lot of clients I see too, there is that aspect of black and white thinking and becoming really, really tied to an outcome without necessarily thinking about what is actually out of my control and when do I have to let go of a particular outcome or accept that I can't shift certain things, especially at work. But let's be honest, family life can be just as complicated. Sharing your life with someone is a really big deal and it's hard. I think the other piece I delve into with my clients a lot is just really truly accepting their unique cognitive profiles. I think we all know everyone with ADHD is completely different and we still have varying strengths and they're not all the same just because we have the diagnosis of ADHD. And then the other piece is, of course, boundaries and strategies. Organization, which I think is probably the one that's most marketed, if you will, as far as ADHD is concerned, is those prioritizing tasks. And I think that actually requires perspective taking. And professionally, it takes perspective taking of like maybe what we think is important is very different than what our supervisor or boss thinks. Time, language, we do not talk enough about the impact of organization on language with people with ADHD. And then, of course, materials. Communication. This is a big one. Perceived versus received is a lot of the stuff that I end up working with my clients on, because I think many people with ADHD have developed some anxieties around getting it right, or they're worried about being disappointed, that they can often perseverate on that piece and it may or may not be a problem for the other person. So it's really kind of acknowledging like what else could be true. How many of you are familiar with rejection sensitivity being part of ADHD? If you can give me a quick hands, if that's sounding familiar to you. That's okay, great. And so one thing we explore with coaching, and this is for anyone that does like leadership coaching, is we explore really getting to the root of like, what is your relationship with feedback? There is more of a sensitivity. And I think that's a combination of what I've seen over the years is like when you have ADHD, and I think school and different experiences chip away at your self-esteem in different ways because maybe the communication's not aligning. The key piece here is to get to the root of that issue. We have to fully understand what is our relationship with feedback and how can we create a healthier relationship with feedback. Consistency in communication, of course, can impact relationships. And then I don't think this is talked about enough, but there is what I call some black and white thinking and some rigidity and I think that can be attached to the rejection sensitivity, But I think it's also attached to a strength of ADHD, which is hyperfocus. We get so tied to a certain idea or a certain passion, something that's super high interest, and it's hard for us to see the other person's perspective. So walking through, again, that perspective taking piece has been so crucial in coaching to kind of work on that until it becomes a little bit more natural. And also, I think there is a social nuance, and I think it context can sometimes be missed by people with ADHD because you have so much going on in your mind. I always say, sometimes our strengths are also our Achilles heel. Who would agree with that, by the way? That like your strengths, like it's a double-edged sword. I'm just curious if anybody also agrees with that. I'm going to personally share that I can get really tied to things being efficient. And in reality, I need to slow down to make either relationships work better or see a full picture, right? And I get caught up in the time management. So the cool thing is that's true for everybody. That's not just specific to ADHD, but if you do know your strengths and you can kind of reflect on how could this also get in the way of my relationships or my professional life, it's an excellent question to ask yourself. All right. So I'm going to share themes I see from clients that I've served in each of these categories. So for self-awareness, when my clients come to me, they're either over or underestimating their capacity to achieve a particular goal or to handle the stress. So sometimes it's not understanding baseline, like where are we now? And if we wanted to run a marathon, we wouldn't be running one 2 months from now. But the excitement and the passion and the high interest sometimes drives us to go so fast. But then when we're not where we want to be, we shut down. Has anybody experienced that? Like the goal gets set too high in too short of a time, and then you kind of become just defeated. Right. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Right. And so one thing I do in coaching is really how do we become more realistic about the small steps? Because it's actually when we go too fast that like is setting ourselves up for failure to any sort of permanent or sustainable change, quite frankly. The other big piece, escapism, coping strategy. So phone, technology, YouTube. Again, I can speak more to like my younger clients that I work with, but it's this idea of like escaping to another world and sort of hoping like the problems will go away, and they don't. And so the escapism piece is understanding that there's something we're not getting, some sort of emotional support that we might not be getting, and we have to find an alternative behavior. There's no such thing as cold turkey giving up technology. The other piece that shows up in work a lot is focusing on the details without seeing overarching themes of connection. So let's say there's a huge project at work and you're assigned one particular task and you focus on that because you think that's the most important piece, but your boss wanted you to pace it in a different way. So that theme comes up quite a bit as well. And then kind of going back to what I think is probably the most important piece is how do we recognize the physiological symptoms of stress? People with ADHD typically have a harder time with emotional regulation. But if we can be more in tune with our bodies, whether that's a fast racing heart or whether we find ourselves irritable, how can we recognize the early signs of that? And the more aware we are, the less we sort of keep going down a path that's going to increase those symptoms, because our brains are just not going to work as well after that. And then again, it's the perspective taking piece. And I think that's true. That impacts romantic relationships, family relationships, professional relationships. And I will say this, as I call myself a translator between neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals, the truth is neurotypical people aren't very clear. I tell them that all the time. I was like, you're actually not that clear. You could be more direct and it would be really helpful. So I don't see this as a one-way street at all. Organization, the other piece that has popped up, definitely maybe more so with my younger clients, in their 20s, is that kind of like a codependency on someone to help organize them versus creating an independent system. We talked about, I think this happens with organizing and prioritizing tasks, focusing on details or a high interest item versus the big picture. And then language and context. This is where I really want to hear from you guys. I have seen a repeated pattern when I talk to clients. And because I work so closely with people with ADHD, I can fill in the blanks sometimes. But I often find that they keep the context in their head and they communicate, but they're not giving enough details for the receiver to kind of keep up. Does anyone feel like that they fall into that boat? And then you get kind of frustrated that people aren't following along. Right. And it's hard because it seems like you're being so clear because the idea is so clear in your head, but that's very different than what actually ends up coming out. And so we talk a lot about how can we create more of a automaticity to providing context when we communicate, because the better we communicate, the more likely we'll actually get the result and the outcome that we want. And then time estimating materials. It's pretty basic. And then communication, which I've kind of, you'll see there's really a communication piece, quite frankly, in each of these categories. My big thing is I've also dealt with a lot of people that I think avoid communication or they lie about something being done or not done. And I think that is mostly rooted in shame and self-shame. I've had to work a lot of scaffolding to like the most important takeaway I tell my clients is forget about everybody else. The worst person to lie to is yourself. No relationship will be more important than the relationship you have with yourself. And the people around you also need to help create a safe space for you to feel comfortable in doing that. Not self-advocating for formats or channels that are needed to be successful in a job. I just recently met with a client. One strategy I highly recommend is if you struggle with processing verbal information because you're not going to remember it all, it's too hard to take notes. I really think clarifying things in emails at work so that you get a response in writing is super important. The key is how can you harness and guide communication to be in a channel that leverages your strengths? You can facilitate that at work and in your personal life. There's always ways to shift it. And I strongly recommend you really thinking about how do I receive information best, or how can I organize it best? And if I need it in writing, I should do it this way. And if I need it verbally, how can I set up meetings like frequently on a regular basis for accountability? We talked a little bit, sometimes with clients I'm working on social nuance, and again, it does take a lot of switching sometimes, going personal to professional. It's a nuance. I know I like to be sarcastic, and I don't do that with people that I don't really know well because it doesn't always hit right. But I think it can sometimes get us into trouble and understanding, or maybe sometimes it's a false understanding of how well we know each other or where the relationship is at, professionally and personally. All right, multiple roles. I'm just going to say it out loud. Even if you don't have a family, I think adulting is really hard. It requires an immense amount of skills and an immense amount of roles. I'm going to put this one here. I'm going to really drive this home. If you walk away with anything tonight, the biggest role you have is is working with your self-concept. Your self-concept is the foundation for every other role in your life. And I have some visuals to kind of show that later. So really digging into, which we're going to do an activity later around values, but really understanding and being okay. Where is your capacity for your stress level or your working memory or your attention? And the more you embrace that piece of yourself, the easier it is to move forward and share that with others too, so the relationships can get better. But again, professional, we've got job, career trajectory, work relationships, whether you're working on a certification or degree, friends, partners, parenting. And then there's a ton of, who agrees that there's just a ton of planning with finances? I'm curious by a raise of hands of like, who thinks like the finance piece is the biggest stressor? Everybody's different, because I would say some people hyper focus on finances and they're almost like honed in, right? Finances is hard. You have to have a system, an accountability system, and we tend to be present. A lot of people with ADHD tend to be like right in this moment, and it's hard to think about the future, right? It's hard to think about the future. So one thing through the coaching framework, it's like we have to develop frameworks for these decisions. So this is the leadership coaching model, right? If you want to look this up, not everybody knows what ICF is, but it's the International Coaching Federation. And when I work with leaders, right, they don't have to have ADHD. That's not what this particular model is about, right? We talk about three things that kind of get in the way. You kind of have to find this balance between ego, results, and relationships, right? Ego is in that, this is not putting ADHD into this just yet, but ego is just your desire to be right and have control, or you're really passionate about an idea. You're really tied to an outcome and you become kind of a black and white thinker. Results are your strategic priorities. In this case, we're talking about life, right? We're not talking about a vision for a company, right? This is more of a CEO type of model. But what results are you looking for in your life, right? Personally, professionally. And then understanding your relationships, where you have influence, where you have an ability to create change or impact culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit too about coaching and therapy are quite different. So we always, an important ethical measure of coaching is like differentiating coaching from consulting, from therapy, because consulting is more like advice giving. Coaching really believes that you are super unique and you are going to come up with the best solutions that work for you in order to reach your goals. And coaches are just guides. And we don't delve into the past like therapists. I'm just differentiating. Therapy is great. I have nothing against therapists. I love therapists and I work with therapists all the time. Sometimes in tandem with my clients. So this coaching focuses on future self and trajectory, right? The goal is to kind of create a roadmap. But again, going back to that self-concept piece, we really want to identify who is our authentic self, not our people-pleasing self, not the person that constantly feels guilty because maybe they dropped the ball, so they feel obligated to do another thing, but rather the authentic framework for ourselves as we make decisions is really like, man, I can only handle so many things this week, or it's going to be a bad domino effect. It's very action and solution oriented. Every session is like identify a clear problem and a desired outcome for every single session. So that might be, I want 3 strategies to be able to say no to my friends when they ask me to do things, right? And then the third thing about coaching is you want to apply that knowledge, like whatever you work through in that singular problem, how can you take that insight and figure out how it applies to other situations in your life? I want to see if anybody has questions around like the coaching model as I just differentiate it, because If I hadn't gone through the coaching model, like the coaching certification myself, I might not have known all this. So I want to make sure I'm not going too quickly. Does anybody have any questions just about the coaching model in general? Just taking a quick look. Yeah. Oh, I see this too. It's funny. I think coaching is so much more needed than therapy for people with ADHD. Oh, I do want to talk about this comment. So, yes, I also see coaching as the action oriented because as a framework that if you go through the certification process, it kind of keeps you focused. You create a North Star. And so automatically there's a framework for your coach to be like, oh, wait, we're getting off topic, right? But it's something that you created. I would say, so I will say this, yes, be careful. A lot of people are calling themselves coaches. I would ask specifically what type of certification that they have and how long it was. I can give you an example. The ICF executive coaching certification, for example, I took 80 hours of class and I did do 100 coaching hours before I got certified, and I take a verbal assessment and I had to take a written exam. And there's a lot of ethical guidelines. Not all coaching programs are created equal. I personally chose ICF as like a former educator who feels like certifications are super important. So I would recommend don't just go with whoever coach, ask about their credentials, and they have to tell you, and they can show you their credentials too. So I think you're bringing up a really great point, George. And a lot of coaches don't take insurance, but I think there's some I think coaches try to be flexible when they can. So I do want to address that. Really important that you don't just take someone's word on being a coach. It's a very overused word. Okay, so we're gonna do an activity. So if you have paper or a Word document or anything like that, and you kind of want to do this with me, that'd be great. What is your foundation for making authentic decisions? The first thing you have to decide really is like, what are your values? And we're going to do an activity around this in just a minute. But the second thing that I think is really important if you have ADHD is also thinking about capacity. When you guys have so much data on yourselves right now, when you think about the patterns of like events that have gotten you stressed out and don't end well, what are the patterns there? And from those patterns you can help develop, man, what is my capacity? Like, hey, I do great doing like 2 social outings a week, but as soon as I add in a third, it seems like my whole world falls apart. That's just like an example. Or it could be capacity for certain people. Maybe certain people who don't seem to like understand that you have ADHD and there's a lot of shame involved and that drains you. That would be a capacity for that person. And obviously how you feel about yourself is important. So those types of boundaries are important too. So when I do an identity dashboard, when I work with leaders, I do a leadership dashboard. And when I work and I'm coaching people with different learning needs, I do an identity dashboard because I feel as if the world has chipped away at people with different learning needs, including ADHD. And it's almost like people oftentimes lose their sense of self. And so it's like, how do we go back to that foundation? So the first thing we do is, how do you really label your top 3 to 5 non-negotiables that are your values? So values are huge. There's like a billion different examples of values. I would love if everybody could just if you're willing to share and you can share anonymously, like that's great. I can share, man, mine are transparency is huge for me. I can name that as my personal value. And I think transparency and integrity are probably pretty well aligned, but transparency is really important to me. It bothers me when other people aren't transparent, and I value being very transparent. Right, like hardworking, um, loyal. So I'd be curious. You don't have to share your values on here, but I'd love for you, for the sake of this activity, before we go on to the next slide, to at least, if you can think of 3, great, that you don't have to think of 5. But try to keep it to no more than 5, because then these are the top things that you're going to want to base your decision making off of. Okay, so in these activities that are done a lot of verbally during coaching, right, is we name those values. But it's not just enough to name them, because we're also needing to build awareness. I also don't think anyone is perfect here. Is anyone perfect here? So the truth is, even if we have top 3 non-negotiable values, we probably break them at some point in time, right? And that could be a triggering situation for us. It could be attached to our self-esteem. It could be attached to shame, or something we want to avoid. But for every value we name, we also have to give examples of how we live by these values. So my examples here, right, transparency is like, I explain why I'm making decisions to my coworkers, so they are aware of how I come to a conclusion. And what you do is, if you have this value, you'd want to come up with an example in each section of your life. So if you're a parent, you might have one that's just like parent, right? Parent, you might say professional. You might be more specific than professional and say, as a boss, like, this is how I want to show up. Or as an employee, this is how I want to show up. And then you can even separate out, right, romantic relationships versus friendships. There's not like really a limit into how you can do these. And you might have slightly different values professionally and personally. Some people do. And again, if that's your preference, you can separate those out, but there's usually some alignment, right? We don't want to show up completely differently at work than we do in our personal lives, because that tends to make us incongruent, which is like another psychologically draining feeling. Let's see. Let's see if we got anything in the chat real quick. Does everybody understand this particular piece of the process? Okay. Autonomy. Oh, this is a good one. Autonomy, memory, talking, curiosity, compassion, security, meaningful work. So autonomy, each of these as we pull apart, is you're going to have to find boundaries, right? With each of these, you would say how you live by these, but you might also have to understand how they impact relationships. So we do one step at a time. I can't do like a lifetime of coaching in this one evening, but I think I want to give you guys enough of a framework. You could do these exercises by yourself. So maybe being my non-negotiable, being helpful. Okay. Okay. I think boundaries on people that are draining. But what's important here, I think, is, and we'll talk about this in a future reflective question, is like, honestly, understanding examples of how I don't live by these values and could do better. But a second question we could ask ourselves is, just like we did with our strengths, how are these values our double-edged sword? When do they get in my way? Or when am I too rigid about my values? Because I do think the rigidity piece, when we're doing coaching around someone who has ADHD, is like, when am I too rigid with this value? And does it get in the way of a relationship that I want or that I need to have to reach my goals? That's cute. Uh, okay. So we're going to go into what I call a decision-making model. So the average working adult is estimated to make about 20,000 decisions each day. And then if you're, honestly, depending what industry you're in, I think I read that like teachers make like, something crazy, like 100,000 decisions a day. I could be wrong. If you're a parent, right, depending what your multiple roles are, this could far surpass 20,000 decisions each day. So the reason we're going to practice or at least reflect on a decision-making framework is because, oh goodness, sorry, gotta get this, my bar keeps getting in the way. Okay. Is all these decisions that are facing us, we experience decision fatigue, right? How many of you actually know you're experiencing decision fatigue? Like I actually had it several times this year for good reason, where I just was like, if I have to make another decision, I'm gonna die. Right. And I think one thing that you have to think about, so when you're reflecting, think about which decisions are the most draining for you. And when you have decision fatigue, you don't really have any gas left in the tank to use good judgment. So going back to that capacity piece is how can you create more awareness of when you have decision fatigue and just name it. You know what? I don't have any gas left in the tank to make decisions. Could we talk about this tomorrow? Or, at the end of the week, right? Which again, I'm going to go back to those physiological symptoms in your body that you're feeling, but you still have to pay attention to the patterns. And if you're for example, if you're in a partnership, because I am going to say, right, parents, I think have a lot on their plates naturally. When you have kids, it's a lot. And so again, how can you communicate with your partner if certain decisions maybe fatigue you more and your partner can make a different decision, or your partner can make those decisions that are more fatiguing to you, for example. I'm going to throw that out there. You can also do this professionally, right? When we're on a team at work, we should be leveraging each other's strengths. So the beauty of this is you can leverage your strengths by saying, hey, I actually, I work really well with these types of decisions. And I've noticed that you, Betty, do a lot better with these. Could we divvy it up that way? This is where you, instead of being a passive person, the more you can lean into your strengths and be aware of these patterns, you can suggest and guide. Now, I'm not here to tell you you're always going to get what you want, because we all know that's not true. But at least be aware and try to advocate for what works for you. Decision making in particular too, right? Is like, it's a total strength of people with ADHD. Like just the ability to hold multiple ideas at once, the creative thinking. It's more about communicating clearly and the prioritization of tasks that gets in the way of the success. And with ADHD, you usually have a higher risk of getting stuck in the decision-making process, right? We call this analysis paralysis. My throat's getting dry. So there is a higher risk with ADHD, or higher correlation, right, with analysis paralysis. And that's not a good place to be, because then we just usually avoid making the decision altogether. Again, I'm just emphasizing why we're going to talk about frameworks more. So here I am. We've talked about values. We've talked about capacity. And once you build that kind of foundational framework and can kind of funnel in those patterns, the idea would be, how can I create something that actually impacts multiple roles in my life? So if I'm going to take, someone threw out the value of autonomy. So if I want to have the most autonomy, right, and I'm living by that value, I want to make sure my money's right, because I can only have so much as autonomy as I do financial independence. And in my personal life, if I value my autonomy in my relationships, I have to have, I say this, social money in the bank, right? You still have to feed other people, even if what you want is more alone time. You're either going to have to work on the communication piece, but if you can somehow tie it back to your value of autonomy, I'm doing X because I value autonomy. You just have to see how your goals intersect. Same thing professionally, right? If I want autonomy, and I don't want my boss to become a micromanager, which by the way, who here hates micromanagers? It does not work for me. I actually verbalized this with my last boss. But if you want autonomy, you've got to deliver your stuff on time and it can't be disappointing, right? So when we talk about motivation to get stuff done, if we have a really strong foundation as to what our values are, and we can create a framework that every time we're stuck, we're like, what are my values? How can I see this through the lens of my values? And see if attaching it to that can honestly build more sustainable motivation. Because one thing I've noticed throughout the years, no matter what age, I've worked with students pre-K through 12th, and then obviously in adulthood, people with ADHD need to know the why. If they don't know the why, it's really hard to get motivated to do something. They have to see the purpose behind it. And so the idea here is you're creating your purpose, right? A coach isn't telling you your values, you're creating your own purpose. And that is deeply tied to motivation. Questions there before I have to be very aware. Sometimes I go too quickly. So I just want to stop and I'll check the chat real quick just to see if there's any questions. If anybody has any questions for me. All right. Yeah. Okay. Woo. All right. Okay. And so I feel like people use presentation words all the time. So just kind of to go over what a framework is. All a framework is a basic structure, underlying system. Why do I think frameworks are important? Because you're not individually making all these decisions from scratch. That's like recreating the wheel, and it's emotionally tasking and cognitively tasking. If you can tie your decisions to your values and keep trying to look through a consistent lens. Someone mentioned consistency earlier, right? That's what they struggle with, consistency. You have to keep looking through a consistent lens in order to be consistent. So we want to lower the cognitive emotional load because that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help us work more efficiently. We want to increase productivity. We can only do that if we have the space, both cognitively and emotionally. We want to increase confidence, right? And we want to lower the anxiety over decisions, because even if, there's a lot we can't control, but even if the outcome doesn't end up perfect, which it doesn't always in life, we know that we made a decision based on our values. And I think we are more forgiving to ourselves, because there are moments where you do the best you can with the information that you have at the time, but you applied your values. That's really what I want to make clear here, because the one thing we have to chip away at is really, I think, the self-shame that comes with when things don't work out. And so the value piece is just super important. Ugh, I clicked the wrong way, sorry. So I just want to share what I consider, I think not everybody engages in what I consider like a healthy reflection process. So if we're going to be transparent with ourselves, because we never want to lie to ourselves, that gets us nowhere, I promise. We want to identify what isn't working. Why does this arrow hate me right now? Ugh. What isn't working? Okay, because we have to find the domino. We have to find the right domino. So you have to ask several questions. It's not just one. How do I contribute to that dynamic? The dynamic that's not working. Everything is too connected. So some ownership of what's not working, maybe it's you're not having a good boundary with somebody, right? And it is impacting your self-esteem, but you do have control over some things. How are you contributing to the dynamic that is not working? How does my future self want to show up? And this might be the most important one because you can't reach goals that are not realistic. What is in my control to change? You can't control other people. I promise. It doesn't work. But there are small things that we can control, and it's important that we put our focus on those things. So I think this is just a nice 4-question menu, if you will, as you're trying to figure out something that you'd really like to change. And then I want to talk about what coaching research shows about manageable habit shifts, right? How do we create manageable habit shift? Things to keep in mind here. So sustainable change requires intention. These are some things that coaches talk about a lot is for something that's for small shifts. You want to make it obvious, right? If it's your vitamins that you're trying to take, or maybe you're trying to journal, where are you keeping your vitamins? Where are you keeping your journal? Next to the coffee pot where you're going to see it? You have to create visual or auditory cues. The biggest missing piece often is you think you're just going to remember it. You need these cues and you're more likely to do it. Right? Make it attractive. I do this all the time. It is really hard to be an entrepreneur and not have people to collaborate with. So I often am like, great, I'm going to go to my favorite coffee shop. I'm going to pair it with something that helps me be productive. Making it easy. How can we reduce any internal conflict, right? Any conflict that we might have that pops up, that can be, stacking it with something we already do, right? We want to start walking. We already have to go outside to get the mail. Every time we go and get the mail, we take a loop around the neighborhood. That's what kind of stacking is. I do it aligned with something else that I automatically do. And then again, make it satisfying. We are all reinforced by something really different. That goes back to the motivation piece. Maybe like even if it is kind of productive, but like sometimes it's just I will say this, I go to the gym so I can eat like what I want. I don't eat unhealthy all the time, but for me it's like great, I stuck to my plan and I'm gonna have a burger and fries. But when I say make it satisfying, right, that can apply to a lot of different things. You have to decide what is a positive reinforcement for you. For the perfectionists out there, I'd love to share this because I think it's a really important strategy. I think it is damaging when we're constantly just writing our to-do lists. I don't know if anybody gets stuck in this. Does anybody just feel like constantly stressed because their to-do list is like never ending? Any hands? Any hands? I really had to work on this as an entrepreneur. Like this was probably my biggest tackle because like nothing is ever enough. And what I started to do instead is at the end of each day, I wrote down what I did. And I was like, look what I did. Because I did get stuff done. And then it kind of changed my mindset to be more proud than more harsh. And those small things that we do are really important. And then, oh, that's cute. I like that idea. I add things to my to-do list that I already finished so I can cross them off. I personally find it really satisfying to cross things off. So to me, it's really different having a bunch of stuff in your head versus like having it on a whiteboard. I actually write it down so I can cross it off. And then the other piece is like focus on it as an identity item. I know we talked a lot about values, but focusing on like shifting your mindset from like, I want X to I'm a person who values X. So that could be like, an example would be, I want to lose weight versus I'm a person who values being healthy. Right? So think about how we say things is really important. And it's a difference. I'm going to keep going back. You see my Band-Aid here. I can't emphasize this enough. I feel like oftentimes I see my clients either putting Band-Aids over things. That's not sustainable. Or they're like, I have to throw everything out and start from scratch, which is immensely stressful and overwhelming. There are some already good things that you're doing. And that's why I say stacking, right? Attaching it to something you're already doing is really important. I don't think we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater because it's too much for our systems. And some of the routines you've developed are probably calming to you. So we don't want to just like throw away the whole routine. That is how we set ourselves up for failure. And we don't want to keep band-aiding because then we're just kind of getting small bits and pieces where we're getting to decompress, but like it's not consistent enough to just create calm. So I want you to think about that. As you set goals, think about how can I not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Throw everything away like this guy and not just be a Band-Aid. So try to live between those two worlds. All right. And I'll test briefly. I'm just to have a brief couple things. The communication piece, I can't be more passionate about the communication piece. When I work with managers and leaders who have employees that have ADHD or other things, and how they communicate and the lack of clarity is really important. But I also see my clients that have ADHD and they're also not being clear. And it makes me sad because I feel like it could go so much more smoothly if we could find a bridge to that communication. So I'm briefly going to touch on intrapersonal communication because we don't spend enough time on that. We talk a lot about interpersonal, right? Interpersonal is between two people. Intrapersonal is your communication with yourself. If you cannot master intrapersonal communication, it's hard to get to good interpersonal communication. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? If we don't get aligned or like reflect on how do you interpret the world around you, right? The first thing I ask my clients is like, great, what else might be true? That's perspective taking. Everything that goes on in our minds isn't always as it seems. And it's and sometimes we develop some unhealthy cycles and mindsets that eat up a lot of cognitive energy. Self-concept, how do you perceive yourself? How do you think others perceive you? Expectations, right? What are explicitly expressed norms and directions, right? In a professional setting or even like a home setting with a romantic partnership, what is actually has been directly said and what is just an internal dialogue that you tell yourself. Make sure you have data that supports one thought or the other and make sure you take sides. Is there missing data? Are you not really sure how you're perceived? That's a great time to engage in a nice neutral conversation. And then self-regulation, right? This is probably the most important piece, like really acknowledging the emotion. And sometimes we don't name it correctly. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm a huge fan of Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, because she actually, it's pretty much like an encyclopedia of words. And it made me realize like, man, we get a lot of feelings words wrong. And she really does a beautiful job. And it's all research based of like, naming the feeling, but kind of being reflective about it. And right, the self-regulation, you have to acknowledge the emotion, you have to use a strategy, and you really have to accept what you do and don't have control over. Oh, expectation effect. I love book recommendations if you guys have other ones. That's great. So these are the top barriers I see. Right, and it's related to what we just talked about. Barriers, assumptions. We make a ton of assumptions, and they're based on either how we feel about ourselves or sometimes a fixed mindset about somebody else. Strategies, make clarifying statements, ask questions, do some perspective taking. And the simple perspective taking question, what else could be true? Is Carol having a bad day? Is that why she was kind of cranky with me this morning at work? Like, you can start putting in some dialogue there. Resources and references. I think especially professionally where I see my clients run into things is like, where's that balance between its self-help and task initiation and needing to ask for help, right? Those are like 3 different levels there. So we talked about leveraging strengths by guiding the format, right? Write it in an email if what you need is written communication. And then I'm huge, I work with my clients all the time. When you can't pull out, when someone sends you a visually dense email, which I don't know one person, or I haven't met one person yet that has ADHD that likes visually dense material. I'm sure they exist, but most of the time that is difficult. So using AI to, hey, pull out and make this a task list for me. AI is a beautiful tool for that. And then again, I'm just going to say the following thing. I told you this before. Neurotypical people aren't always that clear. So if you feel like you're getting vague directions and you're leaving feeling like, God, I have no idea what this person wants, like my boss wants, my colleague wants, my partner wants, think about, I always say having default questions is great. Could you be more specific about what you're looking for? Could you give me an example, right? Things along those lines. Questions always get us much further than declarative statements. And then this is my last little diagram when I'm deciding how do we determine the best way to communicate, right? Face to face, written, text, all the things. One, I definitely say in a professional environment, ask for guidance. They are not specific enough. I've worked with enough organizations now that they expect their employees to kind of figure it out. And I don't think that's really fair. So ask for examples. When is an example that I would use Slack versus, whatever else, email, or when should it be a in-person one-on-one conversation? Definitely ask at work. They can be clear with you. They're just not upfront. Right. I always think of urgency, the sensitivity of the information, and the relationship you have with that person. Are you close? Are you acquaintances? These are the kind of this is the Venn diagram of like how I choose the channel in which I communicate, because the channel always matters. I think we know that. And you have to be aware of like what's your preference for a channel and what's the receiver's preference for the channel, and where will the message get the most lost. Seconds to dollar rule. All right. We are opening up to questions. And this is my contact information right here. If you wanna, you can scan it. I'm very proud of my modern day. It will just pop up in your phone and you can save me as a contact if you'd like, but I'd like to take any questions. Can you go back to the barrier strategy slide before the end? 100%, I can do that. There we go. I can do that. If anybody has a question about coaching, or just maybe if you have something specific at work, like what would you do, or I'm happy to answer anything if it would be helpful. and I am gonna shamelessly plug, I really value feedback too. So I am just gonna say, if you can, I can send you a dashboard, an identity dashboard, if you want to work through it on your own. But if you do this one and you fill out the survey, I'll happily email that to you. I truly would love your feedback. So it's just a few brief questions. If you're willing to fill it out, I'd really appreciate it. How do I ask people to send it in an email? Okay, so the key here, how do I ask people to please send it in an email? There's a couple things that I would say here is like, how can you, depending what the meeting is, I'm assuming you're talking about work, Sarah? Is that work related? Because the context does matter. I'm assuming it's work. Okay. So I think here, a couple things that you could do that you think would help everybody is just one, meetings, for example, is like, I think you could directly tell your boss, listen, I like having a written reference. You could just say, I have a lot of different projects I work on, and it's nice for me to have a written reference, and I don't want any miscommunication. So could you, in the future, could you summarize what you want in an email so I don't miss anything? That looks like you being eager to do the work and you don't want miscommunication. I think if you're having the meeting live and you want to be sensitive to being a professional, you can try to take notes. And then I would go back to my desk. I tell my clients sometimes, like, if you feel like you missed something, I would just shoot a quick email saying, this is what I took away from our meeting. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. And then I send it in the email. I took that initiative, and they're not going to come be verbal with me again. I mean, that would be a little weird. Typically, when you send an email, you get a response in email. So I would make your clarifying response in email. And then if it's your supervisor, I think it's just like sharing, you know what? I have a lot of different tasks I'm working on here, and it's much easier for me to be a good employee if it's written down. Could we do this via email versus talking? I think people would see that as being really empowered. So I actually coach a lot of clients. That's a good question. Someone asked about how do you, like, what's your advice on if someone lost a job? And this does happen to people with ADHD. I do agree. It's that reflective process. So something similar. So I've coached several people that have lost jobs. I work a lot in that sense. Sometimes you have to work. My advice is two-way. One is making sure that if repair can be made with your references, that's really important. And then I would definitely say, going back to patterns, every mistake we ever make, I swear we should leverage the heck out of mistakes, because you can always ask HR for like your performance reviews. Like, it depends what company it is, but I think looking back on that data, and I always get my clients to think, how could I have self-advocated? Or when did I not ask when I wasn't sure? Like, when did I not ask for help? Or when did I pretend to understand because I was embarrassed? And we usually really just identify what got in the way so that it doesn't happen in a future job. Outside of that, we want to make sure that we reach out and communicate, and maybe if we did fall short, right, acknowledge it. But the biggest piece for me is, how do we not make those same mistakes in the future? And how do we embrace our ADHD, and be transparent in a way where we don't expect everyone to accommodate us per se, but acknowledge, hey, I'm going to do a better job if you send that to me in writing. And where are the references and resources? I want to self-initiate these tasks, but I find the way you guys organize this to be really difficult. How can we compromise? Really, I work a lot around like language and questions. Does that sort of give you an idea, George? I hope that answers your question. It's kind of hard without knowing. And maybe also figure out, I mean, sometimes it's not always the case. Sometimes people lose their job too because they didn't really like it and it didn't play to their strengths. So like, I do a lot of career stuff where it's like, are we picking jobs that set us up for success, or are we picking jobs because we think we like them, but the skill set itself we hate? Spoiler alert, I thought my first job out of college was going to be so dreamy and fun, and I hated it. I knew I hated it 6 months in, and it was really hard to do it when I didn't like it. As for meeting minutes, right, AI's around. You could have, I'm sure there's a committee where you could sit of it. Hey, why can't we have AI take the minutes? This would be good so that, it would build good culture because there's nothing lost in communication, right? It would help people with self-help skills. I think you can I like that idea, ask for meeting minutes. Or asking HR, why don't we adopt AI meeting minutes, right? Why can't it become part of the culture? Okay, could the comment about no standardization and certification is the coaches? Oh, there is standardization in certifications for coaches. ICF, I'm most familiar with ICF because that's what I did. Anyone who says they're credentialed, you can look up and see what what the requirements of that program is. Like if you Google ICF right now, you'd see exactly how many hours of class and that. So that's what I would just sort of recommend. Any coach that's certified would be more than open to sharing. Like if someone asked me for that, I would be like, hey, here's a copy of my certificate. It has a date and the name or whatever. Does that answer your question, Sonia? I think there is standardization in ICF, and that people look for coaches that have a background that's helpful to them. Like my niche is definitely the fact that I've worked with like a whole bunch of neurodivergent individuals. So like I have a different approach. I hope that answers your question, Sonia. I think as soon as you ask what their certification is and they don't have one, they're not going to lie about having a certification, but I could be wrong. Okay, these are amazing questions, guys. Newly diagnosed. That man, you have like a clean slate. Like my advice for newly diagnosed is what's going right in your life, like what routines do you like, and what has felt really overwhelming. I think sometimes, at least my clients that get diagnosis, and I used to be like the gatekeeper for whether or not a kid should get tested in school, and I think it can be really empowering to kind of understand like why certain things are more difficult. So I would just start by like looking at patterns. Um, oh, um, I don't mean, well, I don't clean slate. Well, my thing is like, something now, right? There's research there, and now you have to look at your own unique patterns. Um, I guess I should have maybe not said clean slate, but like answers. I think it gives you a new lens to look through. Does that help, Jordan? Because I think sometimes without having a diagnosis, people tend to go to this place of like there's something wrong with me, and there's not. It's just this is how your brain works a little bit different, and you need different systems. So I think look at the diagnosis as like, hey, this is a new lens to look at things through, and like what strategies should I be engaging in? And that's where I would kind of start. Because if you're
Thank you.
overwhelmed, does that helpful?
Yes, I
Okay.
I knew what you meant by clean slate.
Yeah,
Like,
sorry. I know. Well,
I
as
know
we
what
say,
you
I don't always
meant.
see. I was like at 9, I'm not always using the right. I was like word retrieval, word retrieval. No, thanks for calling me out on that. I love that.
No, no,
Thanks for
no,
calling me out,
that's
number one.
okay. That was cute.
And but new lens, that's really what I want to say, because I do
Mhm.
think the idea is like, how do you get clarity and answers? And I think there's so like, it does provide a lot of answers, and as well as, okay, it maybe gives you motivation to buy into some strategies and to do things differently.
Yes, I'm looking at it
Right?
as a fresh start. So I know
Yeah.
some things about myself I didn't know previously. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course, anytime. Okay. How do you deal with a boss who is non-responsive? Oof. I mean, honestly, that complicated boss one sounds like an HR issue. Like some of this stuff isn't ADHD. Like I've had had some hard bosses. I think, oof, I don't know that I can answer. That's a complicated question. I would just say if HR, I guess maybe like during your evaluation process, bring it up so it's in writing. If I really feel like there's something that's not working or creating bias, I want that in writing. So at least I can go back to it from a company perspective. Like, hey, I told you about this. I told you this is what I needed and I didn't get it. And as much as you can document that is helpful. That's my advice on that one. Keywords in the moment. I'm going to tell you something, Sarah, I'm going to tell you something. People, I think people need to be more understanding. That's my take. That's like been my whole goal. This is why I want to like translate between neurodivergent and neurotypical people. I think it's easy to just say, oh, I misunderstood the meaning. I think this happens a lot, misinterpreting the question, maybe being asked because you miss out on a keyword. And again, because I work with clients and I'm empathetic to this, I say, I think you might have misunderstood the question. I want to give you the perspective of a neurotypical person, though, since I work with leaders. I think the truth is like neurotypical people sometimes get embarrassed and they don't want to embarrass you. And so they don't necessarily correct in the moment. I actually do a lot of parent coaching because I'm like, you have to help support them in this particular skill when they're missing things, but you need to support people without creating more shame. And so I think you can say like, oh, I must have misheard the question. I mean, you can say that. And hopefully nobody's getting like mad, but you should know it's something I'm working on with a lot of neurotypical people of like, if it seems that they misunderstood the question, like I think you can correct them in a kind way. I don't have a fast, easy fix for that other than advocate for yourself.
Jane, I've been monitoring the questions in the chat here, and I feel like you have addressed just about everything as you were going along, which was pretty amazing that you were able to do that. But also at the end here, but there were a couple that I noted. I just wanted to bring your attention to. Somebody was not able to use her phone to access the QR code and wondered if you could put a link to the survey in the chat.
Oh, yes. Thanks for asking. I might actually stand. You guys can see my face now. I don't have to share that screen anymore. Yes, I would love that. And I really, truly appreciate you taking the time to fill it out.
Wonderful.
Thank you guys for being so interactive. This has made this really fun for me. Like I said, I really love the work that I do. And it's nice. It's great feedback for me to know kind of what's going on and how I think we can all do better because I'm trying. That's the goal, right?
Yeah.
So
There was one other thing that somebody asked, which I think I'll just throw in here in the last couple of seconds. Somebody asked if you had a quick best resource for teens and or seniors. I assume this would be like high school students that might be useful for that population.
Sorry, can you say the question one more time? I was multitasking.
Sorry.
Yeah, now ask again.
A quick or best or both resource for teens or a high school senior, for example, for learning about how to manage their own ADHD. There weren't a lot of specifics in the question, but it was about asking for resources for teenagers.
I mean, if they have, I know that every specialist at every school is not created equal. I know that, like, that's a reality. I've worked in education. So I would say if you can find the resource, I do think if you do have resources in your school, I would try to take advantage of those. I know that quality can vary, and that's true in every single industry. Chad is a great resource, I think, as far as getting materials, understanding the diagnosis. I can't push enough how important it is for kids in secondary school, honestly, all students, to really understand their diagnosis. A lot of what I'm seeing that happens in careers when I work with my clients is that they never really fully understood their cognitive profile. I know that can be different because some ADHD diagnoses come through like a pediatrician, which is really different than having like a full cognitive profile. But that's kind of why I like the full cognitive profile. Everybody's super unique. So I mean, yeah, I would start with that. I mean, if you can get free testing through the school and just get even more information, I think, I mean, it's an advantage to understand how your brain works if you have access to that. And if it's a free resource, I highly recommend it. I know there's some more bureaucratic red tape in the public school system, but if it qualifies, I would say that's a great place to start, requesting that the counselor or someone that works in the special ed department, hey, could you sit with my son and explain his cognitive profile to him and go over strategies? Because I do think the in-person piece is like super helpful. And I spend a lot of time with my clients doing that. And I think it's very valuable because it's all about their approaches to learning versus a Band-Aid, right? Like a tutor. I would, if you can get a specialist as a coach versus a tutor, I think that's helpful too, because the idea is like the difference between just working on one subject, as we talked about before, is like, how can they see their approaches to learning and impact more subject areas at once? And a lot of that has to do with like buying into the strategies and buying into how their brain works. Again, difference between the Band-Aid and maybe a more holistic approach.
Yeah. And there are lots of people out there who do specialize in ADHD coaching and or executive function coaching, which is, almost the same thing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is like, I'm really big in AI is an excellent tool for people with ADHD, because the visual density, again, we don't talk about it enough, but it's really hard for students to go through like whatever, a thick syllabus or like a long project piece. And you can just blop that in there and say, create a checklist for me and a timeline. And so when I think of a free resource of just like, how do I make this so less overwhelming? At least first pop some of that stuff into AI. And again, a lot of kids with ADHD that I've worked with before, they do better by listening to books versus reading them. I found that, again, depends, not every cognitive profile is the same, but how do they take information in best? And let's make sure they're getting that content in that channel.
Do you have any specific recommendations for AI apps that would be helpful? I went to a presentation and somebody mentioned something that I cannot remember the name of it, but it was very much a to-do list kind
John
of.
Green. Yes, hold on. That's funny. Of course, I'm not going to remember it. There is one, and I wrote it down. And the question is do I have it? Can I find it in a quick amount of time? No.
Yeah.
I have used just regular Chat GPT with my clients, like the free version, and it's pretty amazing. And I do this comparison of like, if you don't ask a clear question, it can't help you.
Yeah.
If I was still teaching, I would totally I'm obsessed with question development. I think it's a skill we need to teach. I would totally be like doing a whole unit on question development and getting them to use AI, but like, how much worse is your answer because you didn't ask the right question?
Good point.
Anyway, I digress.
I think also Pam might jump in here.
I know Fiona looks like she has her hand raised, but I don't know if I didn't answer your question. Fiona, do you want to?
Hi. Yes. My question was the question about the boss that does not communicate. So, yeah, it's an issue, but I work for the federal government, so
God, yeah.
Going anywhere. She's been there 3 years. It's worse, and it's so frustrating me because I need direction. I need to know why we're doing stuff, what our goals are, and we just don't know. So it's just like beyond frustrated.
Yeah, super impacts motivation. I agree. I feel like I'm like that as well. So, yeah, the best is like HR. Like, I mean, I would put that on it. Like, I just put it on the evaluation feedback if you ever get to give it, and if you can talk to HR, like, great. I don't have. I can't fix the federal government. They are kind of old school when it comes to management. So. That's the best I can do is try to get that in writing. And who else is in your sphere of influence that might make a bigger splash than you? That's like when I'm trying to create cultural change, I think about who else has more power than I do to shift things. Is there a committee with an initiative? I don't know. I do think accessibility definitely falls. It's not talked enough about enough, but like just like the DEIA.
Yeah.
I like I guess there's power in numbers. I guess it's also
Yeah.
what I always think when something's hard is like, is there anything else that you can join or join other voices that might be how can you get some movement behind it? Those are really hard things to shift.
Yeah, I have a couple of DEIA programs set up for the office because people have been asking for it because of the unorganization and all that. But my boss never attends them, but that's okay. At least the employees, we attended, like we did some emotional intelligence the last time, because definitely need that with this job because you can get frustrated very easily. So, but I wanted to just comment on the Google. I love AI because in the past people used to say, "Oh, I don't understand your email. What are you asking for?" So now I put it in there and say, "Can you organize this in a way?" And I have not got any complaints from folks like, "We don't know what you're saying." And that's so helpful because I used to feel so down about myself when I was saying stuff and people are like, "I don't know what you're asking."
Right. And I want to just attach that to, I apologize. I don't know if it was Sarah or who asked the question of like, how can I be more clear? You can't do this in the moment verbally, but for email, I've also gotten my clients to say how they would say it, and AI cleans it up too. So if you have trouble organizing your language in an email, it's not just for like translating the email you receive that might be visually dense. If you're also having trouble organizing your thoughts in an email, it's great, like put your raw thoughts in there and then say this in a more organized way, and that can also help you get what you need as well.
Thank you so much. I'm giving you a break because we can go on for hours.
Yep.
This
No, thanks.
Absolutely incredible lecture, Jane. Thank you so much for all this knowledge.